Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Rethinking Full Stack Cost and Compromise. My name is Jeremy Osborne. I'm the Academic Director of Aquin Gymnasium, which you can find at thegymnasium.com. And what do? Well, we offer free online courses on topics such as web design, front-end development, user experience, JavaScript, and much more. This webinar is the latest in our series of discussions with notable figures in the industry. Today I'm joined by two said esteemed professionals, Eric Meyer and Dan Mall. I'm going to do some formal introductions in just a moment, but let's talk a little bit about the format of this. I'm going to be talking with Eric and Dan for about 45 minutes and then leave around 15 minutes at the end to take questions from everyone here. We do have Gymnasium's own Kier Cullen Janey in the background, and she's going to be available if there's any technical problems or support that you need. Feel free to enter it in the chat window in the control panel here. And there's also a questions section, so you can add those questions at any point, but again, we're only going to answer them at the end. Also, when you registered, some of you sent questions ahead of time, so I'm going to be sprinkling some of those throughout the event, and we'll spend some time talking about those. So thank you for those. So on to our guests. First of all, we have Eric Meyer, author, speaker, blogger, sometime teacher and consultant, technical lead at Rebecca's Gift, and co-founder of An Event Apart. Eric's been working on the web since 1993 and still finds it deeply compelling. He also released the 4th edition of CSS, the Definitive edition, co-written with Estelle Weil, published by O'Reilly. Good afternoon, Eric. How are you, sir?
Pretty good. How about you?
Fine, thank you. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, glad to be here.
And next up, we have Dan Mall, creative director and advisor from Philadelphia. He is the founder and executive director of SuperFriendly, a design collaborative that brings exquisite creative direction and design to the world's most important and interesting organizations. Also the author of Pricing Design, co-founder and CEO of Superbooked, and writes about design and other issues on Twitter and on his site, danmall.me. Hello, Dan. How are you, sir?
Hi there. I'm doing great. It's a cloudy, windy day in Philly, so I'm happy.
Cloudy, windy day. It's the same here in Boston. And how about you, Eric? Cleveland, what's the weather like?
It's somewhat cloudy, although not too bad for this time of year. And we had frost on the ground this morning, so
nice.
It's the first time since last winter that we had frost. But there it was. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, both of you, for joining me. I am super excited to have this conversation. And before we kind of dive in, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the rationale for this discussion and some of the thinking that went behind this topic, which has to do with the difference between full stack web development and front-end web development. But kind of more specifically, I'm going to point to this article by Mandy Michael, and her Twitter handle is down below. And the article had this compelling title: "Is there any value in people who cannot write JavaScript?" And if you read the article, it talks a lot about this this kind of interesting dynamic in the web industry and among managers and folks who run web teams and among designers and developers about the emphasis on full stack, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But really what that is HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and potentially some other backend frameworks. So that's full stack. And then on the other hand, we just have front end, which again, you can define what that means. But for now, we'll just say HTML and CSS. Some other folks have written about this too. Here's another interesting article by Brad Frost, and the link to that article is down below as well, where Brad talks about walking into organizations and asking who owns the front-end code here. And typically that answer, which should be simple, is not always simple. Who does own the front-end code? So those are some of the things that kind of inspired this talk. And there's just a few other things that came up in the questions that the registrants came. So I'm going to tear through just 3 of these, and this will help frame the discussion, hopefully. So, Melissa asked this: where does one start to make that decision between front end and full stack development? So this is kind of one part. This next part is, without an agreed definition of how much stack it includes, is this term full stack even useful, or just a resume buzzword? And then last, full stack developer hadn't been coined as a term or need in the 90s and 2000s. Did managers or did developers originate it? So let's just make sure we're on the same page. And it'd be interesting, both Dan and Eric, to kind of hear, first of all, what your definition of full stack is. So Eric, do you want to take a crack at that first?
Oh, I was going to throw it to Dan first because he works with clients more than I do.
Let's go for Dan first.
All right, I'll take it first. So it's a tough one because I think as an industry, we don't agree on the definition. So like you said, Jeremy, when you're kind of teeing it up, some people call full stack HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? A lot of people would call that front end, right? They would say HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is the front end, and the full stack means front end and back end. So I think to me, that's one of the places to start is like, what do you mean when you say that? And so for me, and when I work with my clients and the people that I tend to work with, we tend to avoid the term altogether and just not say it because people don't know what we mean by it because we always end up having to define it. So I'm not sure that I have a good definition for it, nor have I seen a canonical definition. I think normally, rather than saying, oh yeah, this is my full stack developer, or I'm a full stack developer, or we work with the full stack, I generally try to be a little bit more explicit, but for clarity to say, oh yeah, we'll be doing the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript, or yeah, we'll be doing both the front end and the back end, which means HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, as well as building this thing in whatever, Laravel or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Eric, you've been in the industry as long as anyone, and so this idea, like, when like, do you recall like when this term started kind of popping up, and like even if you can't recall that, like, what's your take on the term in general?
Time gets fuzzier as I get older, but I feel like in the last 5 or so years is when I've started seeing it a lot. I may have come across it before then, but it feels like that's the sort of rough time frame in which I started to see it. I mean, to me, if someone said to me, define full stack, I would probably say front end plus back end, right? Which front end, as we said, means HTML, CSS, usually JavaScript, and then back end is whatever's in back. But that's because I come from a front end perspective, right? Like I've done back end things, but I've primarily worked in the front end for all these many years.
Right.
If I were more of a back end person, I might say it's the browser plus these 6 things that we've installed on our server. And I think that gets to what Dan was saying, is that there is no agreed upon definition, and depending on who he's talking to at a given client, even at a single given client, if he's talking to the back end guys, they have one thought about full stack, and the front end women have, or front end people have a different view of the stack. I mean, if you want to get super technical about it, the full stack is literally every piece of technology, front end and back end.
Right.
But that's different, right? That's the front end. I think probably we tend to have a clearer view of because there are so few actual things, right? You have HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and if you want to count images as a 4th part of the stack, which we could have that debate, that's it.
Right.
The only way you can parse that any finer is, well, which format of image are you using? And, if you're using a particular JavaScript framework, which one is it? Those sorts of things. Whereas on the back end, it could be PHP, Ruby, Laravel, Expression Engine, which is sort of PHP, and et cetera. It's right. There's a whole lot of stuff that can happen on the back end. So I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes from. And it's much easier to just say, it's these 3 things on the front end plus server over there, right?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
Is it Apache or is it Expression or is it .NET, ASP, whatever they're calling it these days?
Right. And I think that's, so this is part of the dilemma, right, is that there is this term that kind of gets loosely tossed around is like, you can do everything. And of course, on the face of it, I think a lot of organizations would look at that and say, of course we want those folks because they're interchangeable, and if you have a team made up of 4 or 5 quote full stack developers, it's almost like you can mix and match, and they can do everything. They could do the user interface. They can do again the database management. And that's obviously a little bit of a pipe dream. And I think the reason, part of the thing is that if this is becoming a standard, does it create a form of anxiety in folks who only consider themselves front-end developers? I think the answer is yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I agree. And actually, there's a guy at DigitalOcean named Joel Khalifa. I apologize to Joel for probably mispronouncing his last name, but he literally has a talk called Full Stack Anxiety, where he talks about this and how he deals with it.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's totally a thing.
And I think the other corollary, the other term that gets bandied about a lot is also the imposter syndrome, right? Which is, again, someone comes on a team and they're supposed to know a certain part of this stack, and they don't, and so they feel like they're faking it. So, Dan, I see you nodding your head. Is that something you've seen?
Yeah, I think the anxiety has sort of evolved with the way that the industry has. So, I'm just kind of harkening back to how I've experienced this as a designer and developer. I remember, doing work in the mid-2000s before responsive design came out, and when web standards, the browsers were supporting standards really well. And I remember Ajax becoming a thing then. And I think, to me, it was when Ajax sort of became popular, because the conversations we started to have before that was, well, you write the HTML and CSS, and then the backend developers will write the JavaScript, right? If we needed any, right? Because we would build a lot of sites that just didn't need a lot of JavaScript. And then when Ajax came around, it started to be like, well, as the front-end developer, I don't know enough about JavaScript to write Ajax calls or write anything like that. So maybe the backend developer should be writing the JavaScript. And then that became really weird, because backend developers, well, it's a front-end technology, it's a client-side technology, so technically this is not part of my purview. And I think ever since then it's escalated, right? So as a front-end developer, I'm like, I don't know enough JavaScript to be able to do this. And since then, right, now we have server-side JavaScript, where JavaScript used to be client-side only, but now we can write Node on the server. Yeah, and so kind of the division of those lines became a lot blurrier. And speaking from the point of view of, I know a little bit about JavaScript, enough to build sites with it, but I'm not by any means a JavaScript expert in the way that I know HTML and CSS. So there is a lot of anxiety that comes with the fact that, I should be writing Ajax calls, but now I'm writing server-side code in a client-side technology. So I see how a lot of people that come from that background, myself certainly, I get anxiety around that, and just go well, I don't know how to do that. Am I supposed to know how to do that? Do I need to learn that? But isn't that somebody else's job? And then am I stepping on toes? So I think the evolution of the industry, I think, maps nicely to the anxiety that, or not nicely, but maps well to the anxiety that I think people that have that experience have.
Yeah, and now that's interesting, because when you did your talk at Event Apart here in Boston, one of the things that I remember very clearly in one of your slides was talking about the fact that modern designers, for example, should know JSON. So how does that kind of fit in with this kind of definition? Where is this line? And I think maybe this is the question. What should someone who calls himself a front end, or to what degree do modern web designers need to know a little bit about this stuff?
Yeah, so I think on the surface it looks the same, but I think one of the things that's really an important distinction is if the lines are going to get blurred anyway, let's do it in a way where we're helping each other rather than in a way where we're deferring, right? So rather than going, well, JavaScript's not my job, it's your job, you do it. Let's instead start to share that workload and say, I know JavaScript's not your job, but I'm going to teach you how to write a little bit of JavaScript, even if that means a little bit of JSON or a little bit of configuring variables or whatever that thing is. And I think that's the thing that reduces anxiety on teams. So there was a great study that Google did. I forget the name. I think it was the Aristotle study or something like that a few years ago, where they studied what makes people perform well on teams, and they analyzed a bunch of different variables. And what they thought, their initial hypothesis was, well, if you put the most experienced people on the same team, they'll all do well. And that didn't turn out to be true. Well, if you put the most tenured people, or if you put the most skilled people on a team, that's not true. And what they found was created the best teams was where people feel psychologically safe. And I think part of that is about just being okay with, or helping your team members, right? If everybody does this, everybody helps their team members to go, I realize this is not your job, and if you don't know how to do this, I got it for you. Don't worry about it. But in the meantime, let me create a scenario where you can learn, where it's okay to fail. It's okay if you don't know how to do it, because I got your back. I'll be the safety net. But that way you can grow too. And I think a lot of it, I think I've seen that reduce anxiety on teams where I go, well, what do you want to do? Well, I'd love to learn Angular, but I'm like, all right, cool. Well, if we don't end up using Angular, we can do something else. And then that creates a little bit of safety for somebody to go, oh, it's okay if I don't get this. And I've seen that work really well in just reducing the anxiety that people have about the pressure that is their jobs. Because what do people think? If I don't do this, I'm going to get fired, and that's a big deal. So if you can reduce that anxiety, I feel like actually people grow better in that environment.
Yeah, and also I think that it's important to realize too. It's what I find interesting, and Eric, I think you'll hopefully agree to this, but I think so that HTML and CSS again may have this reputation as kind of being like easy or something like that, and again what I think of, and I go directly to something like this, which is, Eric, this is a copy of your latest book, CSS the Definitive Guide, and if I remember correctly, it's about 1,100 pages.
Almost. It's actually, I've been saying 1,088, but I forgot that the PDF counts the front and back covers, so it's actually 1,086 pages.
So to me, like that by itself is almost like, well, this CSS is a language, and it's a large one, and it's so talk a little bit about that.
I should admit that 4th edition doesn't even have every bit of CSS it could have. There are bits that I left out because they're too fragmentary right now. One that I think will surprise people is multi-column. Left it out because browsers just don't deal with it the same way, and the whole spec might be about to change anyway. So that probably could have added another 10 pages. But CSS, I mean, CSS more and more, this has been true for a long time, but more and more it reminds me of that old tagline, minutes to learn but a lifetime to master. It might be a large number of minutes to learn just because there are so many properties, but what the mastery comes from understanding how all those pieces interact with each other, which is the source of most of the bugs, to be honest, at least these days. If you come across a layout bug, it's probably because somebody didn't think about this particular combination of things that you happen to put together, which is why when people run into those, it's super important that they report them, to Firefox or the WebKit people or whoever, right? To say I had a flex box in a grid that had some absolutely positioned stuff in it, and then I added an SVG that I had a clipping box on, and suddenly the whole thing, right? I mean, whatever it is, just because nobody ever managed to get down to that level of testing. And that's why CSS, for example, is a lot more complex, but also a lot more powerful than people give it credit for. Right. I think HTML is kind of the same. I think most of us learn HTML, like learn the bits of HTML we need to do the thing that we're doing, and we forget that there's a whole lot more in there that rarely gets used but might actually be useful. Not many people used the data attributes until they were forced to by some framework or other, and their only understanding of data attributes is how they relate to being used in that framework. But there's a lot more that could happen there. To pick one example, there's plenty more as well. The various input types, which admittedly not supported super well, but there's a color picker input. You can literally say input type equals color, and in theory you should click on it. It'll give you a little palette where you can pick a color off a color wheel and have little sliders and all that kind of thing. Those haven't been very well supported, but they're there. Right. And most of us aren't aware of them. And HTML4, as simple as it seems, is still complex. I think the reason that the two of them sort of get looked down upon by people who are more traditional programmers is that HTML and CSS don't really have things like looping structures or real conditional logic. CSS has that a little bit with media queries and feature queries, but it's pretty coarse-grained. It's not the, let me test for these three things in this like combination of parentheses and symbols, and then if those all evaluate to true, then do a thing. It's not that kind of language, which in one sense is good because by not being those kinds of languages, HTML and CSS are incredibly fault tolerant. Right? You can botch half your markup and half your CSS and still have something come out the other end.
Right.
That's a really remarkable design paradigm. And most imperative languages, compiled languages or even JavaScript are not like that. You get one, curly bracket missing and the whole thing just fails, which is XML is kind of the same. Actually, XML is the same.
Right. So why is it then that it seems pretty self-evident, I think, that that this, both HTML and CSS feel like they're pretty complete and deep disciplines. But again, I turned to some of the questions that we got, and I got this one, which I thought was kind of interesting. Why is there still weirdness between front-end development, back-end development? In my traditional organization, back-end development still dominates tech leadership and decision-making. So I found that kind of an interesting question, and I think it kind of speaks a little bit to this idea of like the culture of maybe engineering versus design. I don't know, but why is it so hard to do that? Is it economics? I don't know.
I would guess that the dominant force in that particular equation is going to be more rooted in the history of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's going to be, which was the larger organization when it got started, and which has paid off more, I guess, or in more measurable ways for the organization. Like if the backend development group has provably made the company X number of dollars, and the front end development people don't have that, even though they're the ones who put a front end on the thing that the backend people did.
Right.
The back-end development people might dominate, and then flip it around. If you're a design shop or an design agency, a web designer agency, front end's probably going to, in most cases, lead that conversation and be the dominant force, whereas back-end will be sort of support for them. But I'm mostly guessing I should have let Dan go first again.
I agree with that. I think that in addition to that, like front-end developers and back-end developers have different things that are important to them. And unfortunately for front-end developers, the hills that they pick to die on are things that aren't important to people who don't understand it. So I've been part of many a conversation. I've caused many a discrepancy about should we use a section tag here or an article tag here, and argue about that for days, just days. And people are like, yeah, but I can't log in. Right, and that's the purview of a back-end developer. So I think that a lot of the things that are important to front-end developers are things that unfortunately are not important to people in other parts of the business. And the things that they relate to are the things that they tend to look to for, all right, well, let's let that drive. If I can't log in, it doesn't matter if we're using a mark tag here. It doesn't matter if we use an OL or a UL. Semantic arguments are literally that, semantic arguments. And sometimes they don't affect the bottom line. And I think that generally front-end developers, they tend to be shy about that, and they tend to go, well, that's not important to me. What's important to me is that we have the right markup in place, or that my CSS is using CSS and not BEM. And those are things that are very important to the process, but people don't understand it, and a lot of developers don't do a good job of communicating why that's important. And so people go, all right, I guess you're just upset about some nerdy thing. Can we log in or not? And so I feel like that's where engineering, and backend development tend to drive more because it's results that you can see as opposed to results you can't see.
Right. And I think it goes back to that idea of the culture too. I mean, I think that some of this has to come from the top down, right? And it's kind of interesting how we've seen over the last 10, 15 years how Apple, for example, has promoted this idea of design as being an important component of their success. And so you see other organizations trying to adopt, at least to different degrees, the lip service to that, and they're hiring designers and they're hiring UX folks, and content strategy folks have kind of got a seat at the table. But it still feels like there's this other trend that comes back to JavaScript that, and Dan, you kind of mentioned this, I think, in your one of your tweets for the event of like, in a world where JavaScript is kind of king, right? There's this interesting conflict happening, and I feel like this is an industry-wide thing, and it's a business decision as well. So, if you were an engineer, let's say you just a thought experiment, if you were someone who was in charge of spinning up a team to create like a new web app for whatever reason, what kind of, and I know, Dan, you do some of this, like your organization is, based around the stuff you do, but you kind of adopt your teams based on the project. So what kind of things do you look for when you're embarking on a project like this, and what are the roles that are important to you?
It's complicated, and I think that's the underlying pinning around all of this is that it's complex. There's a lot of variables, and they change all the time, project to project, organization to organization, and so one of the variables is what is the ratio of how quickly we need to do this to the expertise that is in-house, to the expertise of the consultant, to what's important to the business. So, for example, one that our industry talks about a lot is accessibility wasn't important to Target until they got sued, and then all of a sudden it became important. And you could certainly make the argument that it was always important. They just didn't realize that. And I think that in kind of building teams or thinking about projects, it's about what really is important. What is the as a service provider, one of the things I'll always ask my client is what is important to you. And so I take stock in what they say is important, but then as a professional who's done a lot of these things, I can also hopefully bring some stuff to the table, and my team can bring some stuff to the table to say, here's some things that you may not say is important and you may not even be thinking about, but we think these are important for you. Let's have a conversation about that, and let's have kind of an education process around those things. Things like if we build this in Angular versus if we build this in React versus if we build this in something else, what does that mean for your team? What does that mean about performance for your users? What does that mean about who can maintain it? What is it? So I try to let the practicality drive a little bit more than the philosophy drive. But it's always a balance between the two, and where it falls on that spectrum between philosophy and pragmatism, I think it varies greatly from project to project.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's I think one of the things, so as far as tie back to the previous question, one of the things that front end can deliver on, and there's growing awareness of this, is like literal page performance, right? So there's how fast can you get it out of the server and across the wire to the user, but then there's how long is it going to take for that to actually start, for time to first display or whatever particular metric you're using. I know of engineering teams, I know they did this at Etsy, maybe they still do, where they would constantly run page speed tests under various network conditions. And they would have like literally monitors on the wall of the engineering offices, and it would show like, here's what this is like in broadband in the USA, and here's what the same page is like in dial-up in the USA and in Europe and in Australia, which apparently they nicknamed the Sorry Australia because Australia has really bad links to the rest of the world. But right, and it would show the videos as like, for as of midnight last night, the last time we took these videos, it took 2 seconds to render the page completely on broadband and 6 seconds in slower broadband or 3G speeds. I said dial-up earlier. I didn't actually mean that. Right, and 9 seconds in Australia. So people could see, like they might come in the morning and look up and see like, why is it suddenly taking 5 seconds to render the page, right? Which has nothing to do with the network speed. It's just, what did we do last night? Did we like add a super huge web font, or did we accidentally push the absolute highest res copy of all the images out instead of the the responsive images or whatever it is? But that's backend certainly has to do their part to get stuff out fast, but then front end has to do their part to make sure that stuff renders quickly, and it isn't a 20 megabyte page, or because it's all these huge images. It's like, how can they shave that down? Because that really is it's a user experience problem, not just in the sense of, hey, we have to not inconvenience our users even a tiny bit, which is, okay, true, but someone who's on 3G and needs this information for whatever reason, and if like the page is breaking because there's just too much data to stuff down the pipe, or it takes 30 seconds to render because of everything that's coming at them, if they're whatever the scenario is, right? They're in the basement of a building and they have hardly any bars on the LTE or 3G. Can they still get this? Is it going to take forever to load? Is it going to take forever to render? And that's an actual measurable thing that I think front-end people, if they're not focusing on, probably should be.
Well, yeah, and to me that almost speaks back to that article I was mentioning earlier from Brad, where again there's a risk where you should be able to walk into any sort of project or team and basically say, who really owns this front end experience. Right. And I think that's part of the danger, is the way I say it, is that if you are biasing your group or your team towards this kind of engineering JavaScript heavy experience, because the truth is that stuff is difficult to learn, and if you're kind of expending a lot of time and effort to get up to date with the latest framework, whether it be Angular or React, I mean that is a full-time gig, I guarantee you. And that's why we have classes in that. We have classes in Node and JavaScript and all these things, because this is the way of the world in the web. My fear is, I think that there's this overvalue being put on the JavaScript and framework knowledge, and the danger is you lose things like who's paying attention to the user interface, and who's paying attention to that to the performance stuff, which again can fall under backend, but do you really have someone who's doing that? Do you really have someone measuring performance? So Dan, like in our talks earlier, you had mentioned that in fact, you have, there's another scenario, which is that, if you have someone or people who are just focused on back end, that can actually kind of almost damage a product or damage a web app or whatever you have. So can you expand on that a little bit more? What was your thought behind that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's really damaging on teams is siloing work, because as I think about all of the projects that I've done that didn't go so well, where everything falls through the cracks is where handoffs didn't happen properly, or where I thought you were going to do I thought you were going to do that, and then someone forgot and no one did it. And so I find that the way to correct that, or the way to help that, is to create more overlap between roles rather than space between them. And so when engineers are like, well, I don't know, the login is right, the login's working, and you're like, yeah, but like people want to be able to see their password. Oh, well, I mean, I just installed the framework. Like if they defer, what might not be their responsibility, but they might be accountable for it, or even just thinking about it, that leads to like, well, listen, I did my work. What more do I have to do? And I think that's a toxic team member, and if the culture of your organization is such that everyone is expected to behave that way, you're actually breeding a whole toxic team without knowing it, because that's what everybody expects. And so I find that's not just exclusive to backend developers, it's all of the roles. It's designers, developers, content strategists, information architects. If somebody builds a site architecture that doesn't work well with an engineering structure, that's a problem too. So it's not just the back-end developers who are the only problem in that scenario, or front-end developers, or anybody. I think it's the siloing that is really dangerous. And so one of the tools that I use a lot is a RACI matrix. At the beginning of a project, I'll put together a RACI matrix of RACI, responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, so that everyone on the project has to be at least one of those things on every task that we're doing. So information architecture, maybe the front end person doesn't need to be responsible for the information architecture, but they should at least be informed of something. There should be nothing that's like, oh, I didn't even know that was going on, because I think that leads to unengaged teams, and that means something's going to fall through the cracks. So I think that by eliminating those silos, I think you start to avoid that problem.
Interesting. So that's kind of cool. Is this matrix is something you came up with, or is this a known thing?
No, this is like decades old management practice. I'm sure somebody came up with it. I just found it one day and I was like, this is a great tool.
Nice. Okay, it's good to know. Yeah, I mean, it comes back to, again, I'll just share one of these other questions, which again harkens back to that original one that I had just mentioned. Is, Matt was asking, what is the minimum a front-end designer must know technically to succeed in today's market? Which, again, I know is very a general question, but one of the things that I think where that ties in is, and one of the things that we try to teach with the courses that we offer is, like you said, understanding. Like again, like your last presentation day was like, should designers know how to? and whatever that is, like code, well, that's another talk, but being aware of the technical underpinnings is important. Understanding what's happening with your node server is maybe not. Okay, so I guess the one of the other questions is, what can we do about it? It is a much harder question. I think this is part of what we're trying to do here, or at least for me and for Gymnasium, is trying to address that. But what other things, like if, again, I think you had mentioned kind of like speaking out. I think it was you, Eric, who was talking about, if you're a front-end designer or developer, that taking ownership or speaking out is important. But what other things do you think?
That part of this is where the full stack anxiety kicks in. There's so much, like, what else is needed? And it's everything and nothing. It gets Taoist really quickly.
Right. Well, it kind of almost leads me to think of, a lot of the work that you've been doing too has to do with kind of empathy and trying to understand real world design. I mean, how does that tie in? Because to me, again, it feels like there's like a, if you're making trade-offs, if you're hiring a team who is predominantly technical and back-end, are you sacrificing something like someone who is really paying attention to that, to the user experience and that has to play in at some point too, right?
Yeah, I guess this is organizational full stack anxiety. If they cover the stack, how are they going to cover it? And if they hire, like you say, if you hire a person who does X, Y, and Z, you're not hiring someone who does A, B, and C.
Right.
And hopefully you can also hire somebody who's doing A, B, and C. But at a certain point, I guess budgets run out. I hear is a thing in organizations. They have a limited amount of money, I guess. So you do have to make those choices. I think, well, I personally feel that having a team that's as diverse as possible and as, like Dan was saying, as overlapping as possible. And when I say diverse, that also means in terms of skills, right? So hiring 6 node developers is not going to get you as far as hiring a couple of node developers and a couple of front-end people and a UX and an IA, right? Mm-hmm. Which seems on its face to be laughably obvious. Mm-hmm. And yet, to think of other ways, in which that that sort of mix can be found, whether it comes from people's backgrounds, their educational backgrounds, their personal backgrounds, the culture they come from, where they grew up, all those sorts of things, age, experience. I personally think, and again, easy for me to say because I don't have to manage a hiring budget, but I think that if we want to increase that sort of diverseness of the team, you need to hire somebody who's new and doesn't necessarily know everything that you need, but seems capable of learning. Because someone in that situation who has more experienced people to help them and who is ready and eager and able to learn will probably actually enrich the team quite a bit more than somebody who's been doing it for 30 years and is there, has become set in their ways.
Right. Yeah, and again, I think it comes back to um, that idea of burnout too, because again, if you are in a in a position and you're constantly having to again learn the latest and greatest framework, and everyone on your team is kind of chasing the tech. Almost goes back to what you're saying, Dan. There's a lot that can fall through the gaps. And so, yeah, I mean, if they're hiring managers and people running teams out there listening, I think that this is kind of a piece of advice worth repeating, and that like diversity of teams is really important. Diversity of skills is extremely important. It tends to make projects healthier in the long run.
And teams more productive, according at least to what research I've seen.
Yeah, and that goes back to here. Let me. So Dan, you had kind of sent that study. So this looks like a really interesting article. What Google learned from its quest to build the perfect team. So this is all good stuff. We're heading into that section where we need to look at questions. So for folks who are listening, again, you can feel free to throw some questions into the question section of the GoToWebinar control panel. But we do have some here. So I'm looking at these for the first time. So we get one from Charles here, and either Dan or Eric, either one of you can take this one. But can front end be divided or split into design versus interaction? That's kind of an interesting one. Dan, what do you think about that? Is the web interactive by default, or is there design versus an interaction?
So I think there's a lot of different schools of thought about that, and I think that one of the articles that you had teed up, Jeremy, in the beginning is the article by Brad Frost about the full stack developer. And one of the things that I know that Brad is keen on, partially because he's written a lot about it, partially because I've talked to him about it and we work together a lot, is the idea of something in the middle between design and development called a front-end designer, right? And so that's sort of saying the person who is writing code is somewhat responsible, if not responsible, then at least accountable for some portion of the design. And that might mean designing in the browser, designing in code, sitting with a designer, being part of that process. So I think that's one side of it. One of the things that I'd love, that I sort of set up some of my projects to do this, and not all of them because it's not always the right thing, but I sort of think about it as a spectrum from design to engineering, and with different people occupying different parts of that spectrum. And so on my teams, it's less important that people have titles, so I think we get away from that, right? So it's like, rather it's more about what are you going to do as opposed to what are you, right? So it's not like I don't hire a front-end developer. I'm just like, some projects I have somebody who is writing the HTML and CSS, and then another person that's writing the JavaScript. Other times it might be the same person. So I think that just knowing that the whole spectrum is covered, and especially that there's overlaps there, I think that's another approach to kind of going about it. So, can you split it up? Absolutely. I feel like you can split up any discipline as minute as you can. Whether or not that's productive for the project you're working on remains to be seen, right? I think that it's hard to say globally that will work. But I think that it's certainly worth a shot to say, let's split these into two parts and actually see what happens. And if that's better than the way that you were doing it before, continue on with that until it breaks. And if it's not, then then I try something else or go back to the way that you were doing it before.
Yeah, I find it hard to rationalize splitting design from interaction on the web. I mean, all design is interaction, really.
Right.
All design all design has to consider interaction, right? The way our books are designed are the ones that are well designed are designed with the idea of the turning the page and what the spaces should be. That's a relatively constrained problem space, right? And how many times have you driven down the interstate or the road and passed a billboard that had like a wall of text on it? You're like, the only way anyone could ever read that is by causing an accident, right? Because somebody didn't design for the interaction necessary for that medium. The web is more interactive than either of those. It's more interactive than any medium there's ever been. Even down to the minimum of I assume you're going to scroll a page sooner or later, and you're going to click from one link to another, or a link from one page to another. Those things have to be considered. And you could try to say, all right, the visual designers are here and the interaction designers are over there, but I feel like that's counterproductive. I feel like you're sabotaging the process, because the web is a fundamentally interactive and fluid medium, and to try to design as though it's not, it strikes me as a bad idea.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Sometimes I coach agency teams, and a few of them that I've actually coached on process and kind of roles and things like that, I've actually encouraged them to get rid of the front-end developer role altogether, that they only have designers and they have engineers. And within the design discipline, there's all sorts of designers. There's some designers that are primarily illustrators, but they're called designers, and some that are 3D designers, and some of those include people that can write code. And then on the engineering side, there are people that do all sorts of things up and down the engineering scale, which is setting up servers or database architecture or whatever, but also some of the engineers are also writing front-end code too. So I think that trying to find an artificial split is tough, but I think the developer role is a particularly tricky one, because it's squarely in the middle of, a lot of places, it's squarely in the middle of design and engineering. So I find that for some organizations, it's actually valuable to say, there's no such thing as developers here, because we don't know what that means. There's engineers and there's designers. Some people that write code are engineers, and some people that write code are designers, depending on where they prefer to spend their time.
Right. Well, I find it interesting that there's, again, a lot of, some of these other questions. There's a question by John, which says, what's the line between user interface and front-end web development? And I almost feel like that's kind of a similar question, in the sense that a lot of what we're trying to do is define these divisions, right? And again, it almost leads into a discussion of the generalist versus the specialist. And at some point, you have to make some sort of definition, right? You have to put yourself in some box, I guess. But are we getting to that? Yeah.
So can I push back about that?
Yeah, please.
Because I wonder where that comes from, where the idea comes from that I've got to be in some sort of box. And maybe it's because I need to know how people are going to interact with me, or what they would expect from me. So I get that a little bit, but why not blur it, right? It's happening already, and I think maybe it's happening because it's actually more natural to do it that way, and we've just been fighting it so long that we think it's the opposite. And so to the question that was just asked, I think it's a good one. Where's the line between kind of interface and front end? And I would pose a question back to that. It's well, what happens if there's not? How does that affect the way that you do things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine in some contexts these questions arise because what you do governs what kind of title you have, and therefore what kind of salary you get paid.
Sure.
I remember when I worked at a university, it was engineering level 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you're this level, you have this much vacation. And if you're this level, you get this much salary. Things like that. But when it comes to the actual discipline that we're practicing here, I'm with Dan. So don't put yourself in a box. There are enough things in this world that try to shove you into a box. Don't get in one voluntarily.
Nice, I like that. Yeah, it's, and I think that this is probably it cuts to the struggle of what all of us here. I've been in the web business for 15, 20 years, and both of you guys have been in there for a while as well. And I wonder, it's again, if you're starting out, and we run into this all the time, and that the entry point for a web developer or web designer is getting harder and harder for us to define. Even when I'm doing creating courses and trying to figure out where is that entry level point, the amount of stuff you have to learn is extremely forbidding, and so I think that's some of this reflects where we are as the state of the web, right? The web is still extremely young, in the scope of other things. So
there's a great article that the agency Sparkbox, which is in Dayton, Ohio. They wrote this great article called "The Hammer and the Chisel."
Okay.
And I love what they're doing because I think what's tough about what we're talking about is we're trying to come up with these global rules, right? let's define what designer and developer are, and then everybody can follow that, and it will work for all organizations. And that's just really difficult to do. And so I love what they're doing, and they're saying, like, here we are changing what our titles are here. And maybe it might not even be titles, it might just be how we think about the work that we do. So they have this position called front-end designer, and they say, but our front-end designers are different. Some of them are hammers and some are chisels. So hammers are responsible for setting up HTML and CSS and architecture and things like that. And chisels are the ones that in there getting animations right and font spacing right and and font size and stuff like that. And so I love that they are thinking about how to define those roles a little bit differently, and it works for them. They're not saying, oh, everyone should have hammers and chisels now. They're just saying this is what works for us better in our process, and so this is kind of how this, and so we're going to stick with this for a while. One of the questions that I'll often go over with my apprentices who are trying to get their first design or development job is that exact question, like, what's the minimum that I need to know? And again, it's the same thing. It's like the minimum that you need to know globally. That's a tough question to answer. And so my response back to them is always the minimum to get into what job. Do you want to go work at Facebook or do you want to go work at a local agency? Because those are very different jobs. At Facebook, you can be really, really specific about your job. I mean, Nicole Sullivan was consulted with them on refactoring their CSS. That is a very specific job. But if you go and work for a local agency and you're one of 5 people there, you have to wear many hats. You have to do information architecture and design. And so I think that the specialist and generalist conversation often gets to, but where are you talking about? Because it doesn't work like that in the world, at least not that I've seen. But if you want to work at a particular place, being a generalist is better than being a specialist. If you want to work at a different place, then being a specialist is better. So I think that's one tool that has seemed to help. It's like, once you pick the place that you want to work or the places that you want to work, you might say, oh, I want to work at small places, and in that case, I need to be more of a generalist. Or I'd like to go work for a big engineering org or a startup or a Silicon Valley company, and there they need somebody who is hyper-focused at a particular thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're seeing some other, similar questions here. I'm summarizing some of these, but, there seems to be, there's a lag as well. So someone is mentioning here that, they work for a startup, and when they're giving the CSS part of the interview, that it's that the interview questions are kind of outdated. They're about algorithms, or they're so that's also part of it. It's a standardization. So I think that's very how do we, and I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if anyone knows the answer, but how do you balance this need for standardization versus someone's skill set? And I think it goes back to what you're saying, Eric, too. Like, some of it is salary, unfortunately. Job titles, job descriptions, all those things are kind of important.
Yeah, and the larger the organization, the more that tends to matter, I think. Because I don't know what Facebook is like when it comes to this, but I'm sure they have, a distinction between engineer and senior engineer, just to make a super simple example out of it. And there might be different levels of senior engineer and different levels of non-senior engineer, and entry level and so on. And yeah, it starts to get down to, well, if I can meet the requirements that somebody wrote in order to qualify for this next level of title, then I can increase my salary by 10% or whatever. And yeah, I would understand wanting to, even if those requirements are arbitrary and were written 5 years ago and don't really apply anymore. It's like, oh, it looks like I have to go learn PHP too, because they haven't updated it.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, and we're seeing some of that. So Heidi from Seattle, I'm guessing, because she mentions it in her question, says, can I get a job writing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript without any training in the back end? Because in Seattle, the answer I've been giving is no. Why would we hire you when we can have both? And then she goes on to ask, is that true in all major cities? So I think that's kind of like a similar tack of, it speaks to the fact that there is this perception out there.
I don't think that that's true in all major cities, and I think that it might be hard to find. I think that's definitely the case. But I also think that I've seen enough of 2-person, 3-person design studios that are looking for their first developer. And you know what they'll do? They'll take somebody who could write HTML and CSS at a good price over trying to poach a Silicon Valley engineer for $250,000 a year. So I think that they may be hard to find because maybe they don't publicize as well as as Facebook's recruiting group or something like that. But I think that they're in there. They're buried. They're not at the surface because the Amazons and the Microsofts and the Googles, they have a lot of press power and for good reason, a lot of them. So I think it's just a bit harder to find. But I do think that they're out there. I've seen them out there.
Yeah, and again, that comes back to what Dan was saying. Where do you want to work, right? If you're okay with working at a small firm, then that skill set is okay. But if you're really dead set on, I want to work, I want the golden handcuffs of a large organization with the great benefits, then you're going to have to come up to whatever level they're looking for. And unfortunately, I think a lot of businesses, a lot of tech businesses, much like we ourselves have sold ourselves on a lie that we you have to always know the latest and greatest. And in the programming world, to some degree, that makes sense, right? If you're learning PHP 2, like, why are you learning that? We're on PHP 5 now, or you C or Ruby or whatever it is, right? Like, learning the version of the language 2 major versions ago makes no sense because the code that you learn might not even work today.
Right.
So therefore, must know the latest and greatest. But again, we're talking about a medium where the first web page that was ever made, right? Tim Berners-Lee's literal first web page still renders perfectly fine in current browsers, and for that matter, is responsive by nature, right? Not in the media query way, but it completely flexes. And this is a medium where there's much more value placed on backwards compatibility than on latest and greatest, but a lot of these requirements come from people who work in a world where latest and greatest is all that matters.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. And I think that because there is this notion that, again, that just because the web is constantly evolving, which it is, I mean, there's no doubt that this is the case, but it's you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? It's like there's important fundamental concepts that haven't changed, that will always remain the same. And accessibility is one of them. Performance is another one of those. So we're almost at the end of this. Let me just see. There's these kind of last questions here. Okay, so. Yeah. So one of the last questions we have here is, again, there's an emphasis on computer science fundamentals that a lot of organizations are looking for. Let's see, do you see a lack of HTML and CSS skills in companies that emphasize hiring full stack developers? Well, so kind of, Eric, what do you think about that?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure about that. What do you think, Dan?
That is a tough one. I remember, the way I grew up on learning HTML and CSS, and this goes a little bit back to your question, Jeremy, about standardization. I think one of the things that we can do to better standardize and have better interviews and things like that is to open source and to blog. I learned a lot that way, and I remember reading blogs and reading books and reading and just seeing how people are doing things. And I remember launching websites and people commenting on my blog, on the blog post launch, hey, I wonder why you used an H1 there instead of an H2, and having full discussions in the comment threads about that stuff. And I don't see that happening as much. And I get why. The internet is flooded with much more of that stuff, and comment threads are tough. But I think that we've lost those kinds of discussions. And now everything's an empty div. It's
I think an answer to the question is, to a large degree, yes. Companies that are hyper focused on must have full stack developer are really thinking JavaScript, and we'll do the front end in a framework, right? And like Dan says, everything ends up being an empty div, or even worse, an empty div that literally has all of the CSS meant just for that div attached to that div, and trying to ignore the fact that CSS starts with the word cascade, which is what a lot of these frameworks do.
Nice.
And so they, right? Because they're so focused on that, working that framework and doing that. Yeah, they don't value HTML and CSS as much as probably they should. And what's interesting is that some of those framework developers, I'm not going to name names here, but I've heard that one of the frameworks where they took all the CSS and inlined it, and that was the whole point, right? They did that on purpose. The people who did that have since realized that there are reasons they shouldn't have done that, and they kind of wish they hadn't.
Mm-hmm.
But, right, because eventually you start to realize there are reasons that the technology is the way that it is, and when you try to hack your way around it, you often end up falling prey to the problems that those technologies had already solved.
Just to play the other side a little bit, I think that part of the responsibility falls on the developer to prove the value of HTML and CSS, right? Because what we often hear is people, the rallying cry is progressive enhancement, and people don't know what that means. And what they actually should be crying, which is the same argument but just a different spin on it, is more people can use our website. That's what progressive enhancement means. Yeah. But we progressive enhancement, right, as a means to an end, or as the end, not a means to an end. And I think that that's on us to solve. We have to change our rhetoric in order to get people to listen to it in the way that we want them to. So I think that certainly the industry is traveling that way, but we're not helping. So I think that one way that we can help is to say how do we speak the language of the people that this is important to? Accessibility is a vague rallying cry, but more people using our website, more people being able to access our content, that's way more, that resonates more. So I feel like we have, we can take that on as part of what we can do, is to say, here's why HTML and CSS is valuable, not just on its own, but because it gives us these benefits.
Nice wrap up. I could not have said it better myself. Well, we, believe it or not, are at the end of our hour. So before we head off, this is the chance, anything that either of you are doing in the near or short term that you want to talk about. Eric, I know you have your CSS book that just came out, an event apart. Denver is coming up in December. Anything else that...
For me, it's the 2018 event apart schedule, which we announced, and also I'm about to, now that the 4th edition is done for the definitive guide, I'm actually going to now do a 5th edition of the Pocket reference and update it to reflect what's in the 4th edition of the guide, and correct some things that were true when the 4th edition of the Pocket reference came out, but are no longer true. I was flipping through it the other day and I was like, what is this property? I don't even what? So, that's next on my plate.
Nice, and you do have a full plate because CSS, as we have said, is a big language.
Yes. Well, that, and I'm actually going to get in some time playing Kerbal Space Program again.
Oh, nice. Looking forward to seeing that orbit.
Yes.
Excellent. And Dan, how about you? Anything on the horizon?
The next thing on my list is to read the 5th edition of the CSS Definitive Guide. So there you go.
Well said.
That'll keep you busy a while. Sorry.
Well, thank you again, gentlemen, for joining me. This was very cool, and thanks everyone for attending. There will be a link to this recording sent out to everyone who registered, and even if you didn't register, we'll be making the link available for free online. You can check out. We do have a site on YouTube, or a channel on YouTube, I should say, where you can see this stuff. So a lot of our past webinars are up there. So feel free to look for Aquin Gymnasium, where this webinar will end up eventually. Having said that, I bid everyone adieu. And again, thanks a lot. And thank you, gentlemen, once again.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.